Amazingly enough, this is the Solid Signal podcast for the week of August 31st, 2015, which means it's also the Solid Signal podcast for the first week of September 2015. And as we get closer to January 1st, 2016, it means that the 2010s are going to be half over. But I digress already. The subject of this week's podcast is the question of, is Netflix ruining binge watching? I read this article that said it was, and the argument was that traditional television that was designed for broadcast 1 hour or 1/2 hour at a time, was really eminently more binge watchable because it was designed to give you that reward that you needed, that sort of impetus to keep going on a much more regular basis. And to this I say that's just a house full of horse hockey. In other words, I don't believe it. It's worth saying, even though we tend to not remember, that Netflix didn't invent binge watching. We've been binge watching for a lot longer than Netflix has been streaming. It's just that, if you wanted to binge watch 24 or Lost or one of those shows that was eminently binge watchable in the last decade, you actually had to get up off your butt and go to Blockbuster Video and get the next disc, at least every couple of hours. And that was a drag. I'll agree, Netflix made it a lot easier, and it showed that some programs are actually very binge watchable and some are actually not. Netflix has made binge watching better and more interesting in some ways, and in some ways it's exposed the flaws that we found in some programs that we really thought were really enjoyable in past days. Let me explain. Now, looking back at old television, there's a lot that I do enjoy binge watching, and the stuff that was really binge watchable, quote, back in the day, unquote, is still very binge watchable. X-Files is still very binge watchable, but for example, Friends is intolerable after about 3 episodes because they use the same music cues. It's very easy to pick up on the patterns, and you can almost tell what's going on with the show pretty much just by looking at your watch. You never really noticed this as much when you were only looking at it once a week, but now that you can look at it a whole bunch at a time, it's just not as good. Seinfeld, on the other hand, if you're talking about situation comedies from the 90s, very binge watchable. But the argument here is that if you look at a show like Orange is the New Black, for example, that it's really structured as one long narrative. There's places that you stop, but it's more like because an hour has passed and not necessarily because you've reached some sort of thematic conclusion all the time. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But what you're really watching is a 13-hour-long movie, which is a really kind of a neat idea and something that you couldn't do before Netflix came along. People just were not kind of thinking in that way. And in the very rare case, for example, when you'd sit down and watch all 3 Star Wars films or all the Lord of the Rings films or something like that, it was a slog, and you really just didn't think about it. So, let me say that I did enjoy binge watching Orange is the New Black, probably more than I enjoyed binge watching Lord of the Rings, even though I probably enjoy Lord of the Rings as a story more, because, honestly, Netflix didn't ruin binge watching. They did a very good job of giving me that relatively constant stream of impetus to keep watching that this article says they don't. So no, I do not think Netflix ruined binge watching at all. What I do think is that the way that we experience visual entertainment is very different than it was 20 years ago, very different than it was 40 years ago. And 40 years ago, for example, you saw a movie, most likely you saw that movie once, unless it was a very special movie, and then you went, multiple times and you just stand in line more than once. And then you moved on. And you talked about it, and maybe you bought a book version of it so you could keep talking about it and whatever. But that was a one-time experience. Well, 20 years ago, you had your VCR or just a little bit after that, your DVD player, and you could own the first installment of a movie when a sequel came around, and you could kind of, you could begin to see the flow. The sequel had to be a good tie-in to the first movie because all of a sudden you could look at that first movie and say, okay, this is where they ended, this is where they started, and it became kind of an interesting flow that way. And really 20 years ago, we were starting to look at the very beginning of the binge watch era. As I remember, for example, I had one friend who had bought every single episode of MASH on VHS tape and kept them in a cabinet, and was very impressed with themselves for doing this, and would sit down and watch three or four. Or alternately, however you pronounce that, back in those days, A&E was running Law and Order a lot, and you could sit down and you could watch 3 episodes of Law and Order, just on live TV. And again, these were the beginnings of binge watching. But 20 years ago, the world was really more of a live experience when it came to entertainment. You watched something live on TV, maybe you recorded it and you time shifted it, but you really didn't hold on to it except for very few people. You didn't have this huge backlog of recorded entertainment that you could get at any given time, and you certainly couldn't pick any series from 20 years prior, and just begin to sit down and watch 10 episodes of it. Now you can, and it's actually not a bad thing. What it's done is open up a whole world of experience and really kind of understanding things in a new way that wasn't possible back then. And it's better, not worse, because you have a choice. If you, for example, wanted to watch one episode of Third Rock from the Sun every week for a couple of years and give yourself a couple of months break in between now and again, you could do it. You probably wouldn't, but you could. And you'd experience that program just like people did 20 years ago. Or you could binge watch. And there's a lot of great longer form stuff. You can really stay attentive for a bunch of hours, or you could just sit back and lounge. This truly is the best time for television. And nothing, my friends, nothing, not Netflix, not anything, has ruined it.